Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session in American English Live Series 21. I'm Dr. Darlene Wiggins Dockery, and I will be with you today as your host, along with my colleague behind the scenes, Doria, who will be serving as moderator, responding to your comments in the chat, and helping to answer your questions. We wanted to let you know that today's session will be recorded and shared across various platforms. By attending and adding your comments to the chat or comment session during today's webinar, your name, your country, and or your comment may be shared during the webinar. By participating, you are consenting to your appearance in the recording and its use for purposes, related to the work or business of FHI 360 or the U.S. Department of State. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, please do not share any comments during the webinar or in the chat box or in the comments section. So throughout Series 21, we are exploring a variety of strategies for building academic skills for success and assessment in the English language classroom. We hope you'll be able to use the practical ideas that we share. Before we begin today, we want to remind you that daylight savings time ends in the United States on November 3rd. This means that the last two sessions in our webinar series may have a different start time in your local area. We will broadcast at 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 6th and November 20th. But it may start 1 hour earlier than usual where you are. Please use the time converter link being shared in the chat by the moderator to confirm your local start time. Be sure to enter the webinar date, November 6th and or November 20th, when using the converter tool. So here's what you can expect today. The session is about 60 minutes long. The presenter will share the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. So we really hope, though, to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas and your experiences. Please share your thoughts using the comments feature or the chat box. When our session comes to a close, you will have the opportunity to receive a digital badge for participation. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a link in the comments. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of the 3 questions correctly on the first try in order to receive the digital badge. So please work carefully. And before we get started, we wanted to let you know about one of our current massive open online courses, or MOOCs, English for Media Literacy as a 21st Century Skill. In this free MOOC, participants will examine the relationship between media and society, discuss misinformation and disinformation, and learn about the technology behind social media. The course is open now, and enrollment closes on December 23rd. Use the link being shared by the moderator to learn more and, pardon me, to enroll today. Now, for today's webinar, building feedback literacy to foster long-term student autonomy. Educators at all levels often struggle with providing effective feedback, and many students express dissatisfaction with the feedback they receive. Educators and students often believe that responsibility for feedback's utility belongs to the teacher. In this session, we will consider how to reframe the way we view feedback, placing emphasis on the learner. We'll work to define feedback literacy and identify transferable skills that help learners reflect on and implement feedback they receive, not only in their studies, but in their daily lives. We'll also explore practical activities designed to develop English language learners' feedback literacy skills. And we are pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Stephanie Rummel. Stephanie has over 20 years of experience in the field of education and earned an MA from Indiana University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in applied linguistics from Auckland University of Technology. Her research interests include providing effective feedback on students' writing, diagnostic assessment, and the impact of affective factors such as beliefs on learning. Stephanie has worked with students and teachers in South Korea, Laos, Turkey, the US, New Zealand, Colombia, and Vietnam. She is currently a Learning Success Coordinator at RMIT University in Vietnam. She has also served as a U.S. Department of State Virtual English Language Fellow. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Stephanie, and I'm going to share some activities designed to raise students' feedback literacy, and I really hope you find them useful. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. I used to worry so much about the feedback I provided. I spent so much time crafting what I considered to be perfect feedback, but often the students just didn't use it. I started reading literature and talking to colleagues, and it was something that everybody struggled with. So I kept delving, I kept looking deeper, and I started to get more interested in the topic of feedback literacy and students' role in the feedback process. It greatly changed the way I view feedback. And since that time, I've been sharing what I've learned with teachers at every opportunity. So it is really my pleasure to be here with you today. So we're going to start by going through the agenda so you know what we're going to cover today. First thing, I want to start with discussing feelings about providing feedback and how we view feedback. Because before talking about feedback literacy, we need to think about, okay, how do we view feedback? What do we feel about it? And then I want to make sure that we have the same definitions of feedback. So we're going to define feedback and then define feedback literacy. After that, we'll explore some practical applications for improving students' feedback literacy in English language classrooms. I want to show you things that you can implement tomorrow if you want. And then finally, we're going to consider how to include feedback literacy activities in your own contexts and your own lessons, because I know this might vary from one context to another. So I really want you to think about it. Okay. So let's get started. And I want to get started with you. So, do you mostly have positive views of feedback or negative views of feedback? And why? What has caused you to have those views of providing your students with feedback? Please go ahead and share your ideas in the chat.
Okay, so we're ready to hear from you right off the bat. Do you have a mostly positive or mostly negative view of providing feedback? And if so, why? We've already heard from um, Helena, pardon me for mispronouncing your name, um, who Helena said, I can relate to it. Spending long time and maximum details in written feedback and feed forward, but only few students build upon it. And then Tom says, positive. Tabashi said positive because it fosters students' metacognition. We also heard from Joelma, who said, I have both negative feedback, a few negative feedback, but more positive. And then we heard from Fariha, who said, information about reactions to a product, a person's performance of a task, which is used as a basis for improvement. So I'm going to deduce that that means positive. So those are some of the responses we have received. Back to you, Stephanie.
This is great. And it seems like although there are positive and negative comments, a lot of you have at least a somewhat positive view of feedback. So that's a good starting point. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Now, the reason I asked is because there have been some problems identified with feedback in education. So teaching staff always often describe feedback as burdensome, and they wonder, is it worth all the time and effort I put into it, especially if the students don't seem to engage with it? And students report that they don't get the feedback they want and they don't receive it in a timely manner. We know we have big classrooms sometimes. It's very hard to get the feedback to them quickly. There have also been studies that find they misunderstand the feedback or they really don't know how to act on feedback. And kind of surprisingly, some studies in the UK and Australia have shown that university students, even if they have a really high view of the class, report lower satisfaction with feedback than other aspects. So it really seems to be the most problematic aspect of a classroom for many students. So there's been a lot of talk. How can we improve? With all the negative experiences reported about feedback, research has looked into what makes feedback effective. And most of this has focused on issues within the teacher's control. So let's look at some of those. First of all, they found that feedback has to be actionable. So students need to be able to use it. There needs to be a reason to use it. And they need to be able to use it. It also needs to be clear. So can they clearly understand what we want? Another thing, it needs to be descriptive rather than evaluative. So even if we're giving positive feedback, sometimes we just go next to a paragraph and we write good. Well, why is it good? This is good because you have a clear topic sentence that lets the reader know what you're going to talk about. Okay, so that is more descriptive. It also needs to be focused on observable behavior and followed by a discussion of next steps. So this is also very important. Okay, students know what they did wrong. What do they need to do next? It needs to be created to meet the needs of the recipient. It needs to be manageable. So, covering everything that the student needs to improve in one piece of writing might not be manageable for our students. That might be demotivating. It needs to be specific. And going back to what students often complain about, it also needs to be timely. All right, so we've talked about the things in the teacher's control that can make feedback effective or maybe not effective if they don't do that. Can you think of anything outside the feedback itself that makes it effective? So what else is needed for feedback to be effective? Share your ideas in the chat.
Well, Stephanie, this topic is so resonates with me because I think of myself as a student. And I think part of it for me, as we're waiting for comments to come in, I needed to feel safe. I needed to feel that the environment was safe, that it was okay to make a mistake. Um, and so that was really important to me as a student. So I think maybe the student's emotional state and their self-esteem may may impact whether or not the feedback can be received by the student. We also heard from Eva. Eva said, it is a way to be sure about what they are learning and establish a teacher student confidence about the teaching and learning process. Then Hamid said, motivation. So that is something that is outside of the feedback itself that makes it effective. Rafat said, if the teacher is good psychological knowledge according to age, can provide differential feedback according to all students. So is the feedback developmentally appropriate? Seems to be what Rafat is communicating to us. Ghulam said hands-on practice on an activity right after class. So can they put it to use? Maybe something that impacts whether or not it's effective. Joelma said, I think that feedback needs to build and not to make the students feel that it's something almost impossible for him or her to accomplish. So again, being considerate of the students' emotions in the process seems to be what our participants agree is important. Back to you, Stephanie.
Those are all excellent ideas. And I hear a lot about, motivation and students' feelings and emotions and relationships. And I think all of those things are very important for feedback. And we often don't think about them as we provide our feedback. All right, let's go and look at some ideas that I came up with before. So you guys have mentioned a lot of these. Motivation to understand it and act on it. Sometimes students need to be motivated. And also, they need to understand what the teacher meant by it. So, also, the underlying goal of the teacher to help them. Then come the affective factors. Those are all those emotions, feelings, beliefs, attitudes that come with the feedback. And seeing value in the feedback and the feedback process. And finally, for me, I think this all comes down to something that teachers really need to build in their classroom, and that is a community of trust. That the student trusts that the teacher is doing what's best for them, and that they also trust their classmates will give them good advice and support them, because don't we all react better to feedback, even if it's not what we want to hear, if we trust that the other person or the other people have our best interests in mind? Okay, moving on. I want to talk a little bit about the traditional view of feedback. This is the one I started teaching with, and I think maybe a lot of you might find this is similar. So, in a traditional view of feedback communication, it's a one-way street. It goes one way. Teachers provide information about student performance. The students rely on the teacher as the only feedback provider. Now, we've also gone to peer feedback now, but still, that peer gives them feedback. And little thought was given to what learners do with the feedback once they receive it. The successfulness of feedback is often judged by the learner's use of feedback just in their next production. And so this comes to a traditional definition of feedback, and I like this one, but many are very similar. So it says it's information provided by an agent. a peer, a teacher, a book, a parent, themselves, experience, but it's provided by someone regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding. However, Sadler argued that just telling students what's right and wrong and providing suggestions to improve is not enough to promote learning. And so I found another definition of feedback that I really like. So I've highlighted a couple of words in this definition. The definition is processes where the learner makes sense of performance relevant information to promote their learning. So I highlighted processes because this isn't a one-time thing. There's a lot of things that go on whenever we give feedback. And that's why it's actually something that's quite hard. And the previous definition focused on some agent, somebody else. But this puts the focus on learners, making sense of relevant, performance relevant information that promotes their learning. So in this view, it takes the responsibility off the teacher. That doesn't mean we just get to sit back and relax, but it means we need to be thinking more about the student. It makes the student more responsible for the feedback. And it requires the student to have some autonomy over the feedback. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the word autonomy, but that means some control or some ability to make decisions about the feedback. And so under this view, our job as educators is to create the best possible conditions for these processes to occur and for students to make decisions about the feedback they receive. So we're going to go on to another discussion question, but first, Darlene, can you think of one process that might be talked about in this definition? What's one process a student might go through?
Well, finding out if the feedback is relevant to their goals. So deciding how they want to use the feedback, if they consider it to be relevant. Um, and so I think, yeah, the performance relevant, the word relevant sticks out to me there.
Yeah, so they have to decide, is this relevant? Okay, so now I'm putting this over to everybody. If we use the second definition of feedback, what are some other processes students go through when they're making sense of performance relevant information?
Okay, well, while we wait for the responses to come in, we do have a question. Rosetta wants to know, is the report card a method of feedback?
I definitely think that it is a method of feedback, but the problem with many report cards is it comes at the end of something. So students do get feedback, and maybe they know what they need to improve on next time, but it's a little too late to help them with now or the course they're in now. So of course, especially depending on how much information students get, even a grade is to some extent feedback, but it might not be enough to act on, and it might just be kind of a little reminder that a student either did well or didn't do well, but it's really hard for them to build on that.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Rosetta, for your question. Um, we do have some responses coming in to if we are using this second definition of feedback, what are some of the processes students go through when making sense of the performance relevant information? And so Mia said, making changes to the way they had approached the content in the first place. Then we heard from Sama, who said, reflect and self-assess. Students should reflect on the feedback, comparing it to their own performance. They need to self-assess where they stand in relation to the feedback and recognize the gaps between their current performance and the expected standards.
That's a
And then,
wonderful answer.
mhm. And then from Farhan, uh, learning outcomes and overall development should reflect in the student's performance. Monica thinks that the process involves repetition, creating another situation of use, and suggests some ways of practicing. So, those are some responses that we received to um, the question that was posed. If we are using the second definition of feedback, what are some of the processes students go through when making sense of performance? Back to you, Stephanie.
Excellent. And I heard reflection a lot, things about self-evaluation. So I think those are excellent. And they're exactly the processes that students do need to go through if they're going to use feedback. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So I have some other ideas here. I mean, it can be as simple as that students read through the feedback. Sometimes they don't even take that step of the process. And then as they read, they try to understand errors and what to improve. Maybe they ask questions of themselves, of a peer, of the teacher. They compared this feedback to previous feedback they received, maybe from the teacher, maybe from a previous teacher or a previous assignment. We need to compare that. Oh, is this the same as what I heard before, or is it something different? And also, they need to consider how they can use it in the future. So these are all some of the processes that they may go through. So now we come to the important part. How do we support students in these processes? If students are to have more responsibility in the feedback process, they need their teachers' help to develop the required skills. And that's where improving students' feedback literacy comes in. So first we need to know what is feedback literacy. So learners' feedback literacy includes having the understanding, capacity, and disposition needed to make sense of feedback comments and use them to improve. So in other words, learners need to appreciate and see value in the feedback process. They need to be willing to work with the feedback, and they need to be provided with agency and opportunities in that way to use the feedback in the future. And they need to seek to understand teachers' intentions regarding the feedback. So what does the teacher really want from them in the future? So some things to think about as we build feedback literacy. Building learners' feedback literacy will help them become more autonomous and provide them with a skill that will help them in all aspects of their life. Even when they're not students, they still need to be able to deal with, to work with feedback, and to improve from feedback. So some things for the teacher to consider is be explicit. Be explicit as to why you're giving the feedback you're giving. Be explicit as to next steps the student needs to take. And encourage them to reflect on the feedback. So this is what a lot of you already said in the comments. Students need to reflect. And you also need to promote a dialogue around feedback and stop this one-way street. Now, a dialogue can be something like face-to-face conversation, but it also might be an opportunity for students to just communicate with someone else or the teacher in written form. And you also need to develop peer feedback skills. So I've already seen that a lot of people are talking about peer feedback and how helpful it is. And that's true. But we know how difficult it is to give feedback. So we can't expect our students to give peer feedback unless we train them. So I'd like you to answer this question before I go on, because I want to keep it in mind as I talk about the practical activities. What difficulties may teachers face when trying to develop student feedback literacy? Share any ideas you have in the chat, okay? So in order to help you overcome or to explain things and make these practical activities more useful to you, I want to know any challenges you think you may face.
Okay, so what difficulties may teachers face when trying to develop students' feedback literacy? Um, I was just thinking of mindset, Stephanie, while we wait for answers to come in.
Mhm.
Um, just the idea of, as you said, the tradition of the teacher is the person in the front who has the information, who's talking to me. And so just the expectation that the teacher gives the feedback and the student takes it, just helping the student to see his or her own role in the process of evaluating and growing from the feedback, I think is important. And maybe a mindset shift that the students themselves may need to make, that teachers need to help and kind of model and scaffold that process for them.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
well, Joelma seems to agree with me. Joelma says, my students often refuse to both get and give peer feedback. Um, Students, again, because who's the authority? The teacher.
Mhm.
Tima says students may lose motivation. Sartaj says to know the student's feelings. Malik said students are not interested in providing feedback. That is the main problem, which is faced by a teacher. JG said teachers may face challenges like students' resistance to feedback, limited self reflection skills, or difficulty in applying feedback to improve performance. And so, yes, those are the responses we have received, some of them from our participants. Back to you, Stephanie.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And this is kind of the transition slide. It's been wonderful to hear all of your ideas and all of your experiences and also your concerns because I understand them 100% because I am also in the classroom. So I'm going to move on to give you some practical activities now. And what I love about these activities, it, they can be used in any situation, I believe. They can be used in small classrooms. They can be used in large classrooms. They can be used with any grade level. And in a lot of cases, some of these can be used even if you're doing peer one-on-one tutoring. So the first activity I'm going to get into is a pretty quick and easy one to implement. Call it feedback integration loop. And the purpose is to ensure that students engage with the feedback and provide a chance for them to decide what feedback they'd like in the future. So first, students need to complete an assignment and the teacher provides individual feedback on their work, on the strengths and areas needing improvement. So this sounds pretty much like what usually happens, right? But the next step is the important one. Students then complete the next assignment. And along with their next assignment, they need to summarize the feedback they received on the last assignment. They need to explain how or where they use the feedback in this assignment, and then they also should give the teacher a suggestion for the type of feedback they'd like on the next assignment. So this is where that agency comes in, this autonomy that they can make choices around the feedback. So let's look at what this might look like. And I did this to show you that students don't have to write a lot because a lot of you said about students lacking motivation. So this doesn't require them to write a whole separate essay about all of this, but maybe you give them a prompt like the two most important pieces of feedback I received were, and they might write something like include a concluding sentence for each body paragraph that links back to the main argument. Be careful about my use of the present perfect. I shouldn't use it when I'm talking about actions that are finished at a clear time in the past. So that's a summary of the feedback that they think, the two pieces of feedback they think are most important. Then they go through and they talk about how they used it in this essay, highlighting the final sentence of each body paragraph to make sure it linked back to the main argument and highlighting all my uses of the present perfect and checking that they were appropriate. So this is how the student said they used the feedback. And then I would like feedback on my thesis statement and topic sentences in this essay and my use of prepositions. So this is going to vary greatly depending on what your course focuses on, but these are the types of things that my students might ask for because they love feedback on grammar, and I try to get them away from grammar a bit and to realize there are other things that are important, but because it's so important to them, I still might put something about grammar in there. Okay, let's go on. Let's stop and reflect. So doing an activity like this, how does it benefit students?
Okay. So the feedback loop, allowing the student to be involved in identifying what of the feedback they deem to be most important. Let's see. Well, while we wait for comments, we have a comment that is beautiful work. So
Thank you.
that's for you, Stephanie. Okay. So let's see. Some of the comments that we see are Tabashi said they can feel their growth leading to growth mindset. Students from Pierre says students will have opportunities to know what the teacher expects from them. And then we heard from Wafa, who says this will allow students to feel that they share the driving seat of their feedback along with the teacher. Al said they can check their progress. Fabi says enhanced critical thinking, analyzing and reflecting on feedback fosters critical thinking skills, encouraging students to engage deeply with their work. And then Sunda said students to be aware of their mistakes and they won't make it again. And that's our hope. And then we heard from Jim, who said it gives them the sense of autonomy. So those are responses from our participants. Back to you, Stephanie.
Yeah, awesome responses. And I like it because the teacher can be as involved in that as they want to be. So it could be that you just like quickly read over it and you don't make any comments, except for that you focus on what the student asked to focus on. So it doesn't take a lot of extra time for the teacher. All right, let's look at another activity. Oops, I forgot. We're going to share some ideas. So students need to explain how they use the previous feedback, which means they need to engage with it. So it kind of forces their hand that they actually have to think, oh, I've got to show that I have engaged with this. And then they're also empowered to show what they want for future feedback. So maybe we're focusing on feedback we think is important, but we also need to know what they think is important. Okay. Now I think we're heading on to another to another activity. So activity 2 is actually something that I did in my classroom. I did a reflective portfolio. So a portfolio means that there is more than one piece of writing of the same style, and students are to take what they learn in the first piece and apply the feedback and do a better job on the second piece, the third piece, all of that. So my context is an Australian university in Vietnam, and it's called Learning to Learn in a Global University. Now, my students, I am not teaching an English class, I'm teaching an academic skills class, but 100% of my students are English language learners. They don't speak English as their first language. So it's an intensive 6-week pre-university course. And these are students who didn't have the GPA or the high enough grade to go directly to university. So they need to do a course first to help them with their skills. They have to do a reflective portfolio, and it is 3 reflective portfolios on the course lessons. And we give them feedback on each one. and they are to apply that feedback when they talk about a new lesson. There's also a group project that requires the same type of reflection, but it's an oral project. And so there are lots of reasons for them to use the feedback that we give them. All right, so here is what I did to set up and plan the project. First, there were the three assignments that were related to each other. And then I designed a handout to guide the students' reflection on the feedback they received, and introduced the project to the class and explicitly explained on multiple occasions how the assignments related to each other. So they were clear why or how using this feedback could help them. To implement, we provided feedback on the assignment at the start of a new class. Students were given a handout to reflect on the feedback they received. They spent 15 minutes reviewing the feedback and completing the handout. And then students kept the handout and they were to review them again before submitting their next assignment. And then this was repeated for the other two assignments. So let's see what it looked like. First, I said my goal score for reflection 2 is, and that means students could pick whatever their goal score is. My students are very motivated by grades, but they might not have all wanted the same grade. So they could pick the score that they wanted to be their goal. And then based on the feedback I have been provided and what I've learned, here's what I need to improve. And those are the three sections of the reflection. They had to write about description and feelings, evaluation and analysis of the lesson, and then they needed to have an action plan to improve one skill. So they could either say that they were happy with the feedback they got and they didn't need to improve something, or they could try to identify different things that they needed to improve. And then there's a question, the two biggest things I will improve with a definite will are, and then there's a place for them to write that. And finally, I wanted to give them a reminder as well that if you have any questions about how to improve your reflection, you can make an appointment to see me during office hours. So for those who wanted one-on-one like conversation about their writing, it reminded them that they could make an appointment. And now I have a little example of what this might look like. So there's 70% someone might want to improve to. The descriptions and feelings, they might say, yeah, I did well on this according to the feedback. But evaluation analysis, rather than analyzing the lesson, I just described it again. So that was the feedback they got. And my action plan focused on multiple skills rather than one. So the rubric specifically says focus on one skill. And sometimes students focus on so many skills to improve. So now they know they need to just focus on one. So the two biggest things I'll improve is checking that I have analyzed and not just described. I will meet with my lecturer and just choose one skill and focus on that. So this might be what it looks like whenever they write it. And what I found as they did this is they asked a lot more questions. And as I was going through, there were students booking office hours in that 15 minutes that I gave them to do this so that they could meet with me and ask about the feedback, which showed me that, they were engaging with it. So now I'd like you to think about it. How might the activity I just showed you help develop your students' feedback literacy? Go ahead and share your ideas in the chat.
Okay, how might the activity that Stephanie just showed you help develop your students' feedback literacy? I love this activity, Stephanie, because I just think of myself as a student. I was very self-motivated, and having worked for years with adult learners need to be involved in the goal-setting process for their learning, for the relevance. They have to see the relevance in order to be motivated to continue because they have so many competing priorities. And so I love this, that they get to be involved in taking that feedback and setting their own goals around it. And so Amir said that This may help develop students' feedback literacy by encouraging the students to be deeply involved in their work. Manihal said it will help students to analyze and express themselves in a better way. Halnya said they can reflect on their success and build plans to progress further. And then Pierre said students will be engaged. Then we heard from Farhan, who said students will get to know their feedback is part of their learning and improvement. And it's a diagnostic step which can help identify their strengths and their weaknesses. So those are some of the responses we've received. And back to you, Stephanie.
And I love this activity because I have 60 students. So it puts the onus on, like it is up to them to decide their goal, and it gives them an opportunity to meet with me if they want to discuss more. But I actually don't have to, do a lot extra for each student. It just makes them reflect on what I've already done for them.
Very useful if you have a large class.
Yeah. So some ideas I had, which reflect what you guys have already said. They need to engage with the feedback in order to reflect. By linking the feedback to the next assignment, I hope they see value. I hope it motivates them. And as a bonus, it reminds them that they can come to me if they have questions about feedback. And I think that opening up that avenue creates that trust I talked about earlier. All right, let's move on to the final activity. And a lot of you have mentioned peer reviews, some positively, some negatively, and I understand that too. So here is an idea for peer review for feedback literacy. So to set this up, you will need to convince students why peer feedback is helpful. And I know that is not always easy. They want to hear from the teacher. But, talking about just having another set of eyes to read through it, how having someone else understand what they want to say is helpful, and just trying to build that trust in general in the classroom before peer feedback even comes into it is really important through things like group work and all of that. But then this is the step that's most important, and it takes some work from the teacher, and that's train students by having them look at a sample of feedback that's been provided to a student and identify what the student had received feedback on. So in this case, I would have them all look at the same piece of feedback and identify what the teacher had focused on. And then as a class, I would have them develop a checklist and a comment sheet after looking at that. So they have to develop that themselves, looking at the type of feedback the teacher had provided. So implementation is to just have students exchange papers with a peer, and students use the checklist to provide peer feedback to their partner. All right, so let's look. This is an example of what it might look like again. So, we might have been going through different parts of a paragraph. So the introduction, they might decide they have to check if there's a hook, a relevant context, a clear thesis statement. And then I always have them put what your partner did well and what needs improvement. So it's kind of a checklist because they're checking each of these, but it's not just a check, because a lot of times they will just go and make checks. And so this makes sure they think what's one thing they did well and what's one thing that needs improvement for each of these different sections. And then for body paragraphs, they may decide they need to check that there's a clear topic sentence in each, there's evidence to support their argument, there's a clear concluding sentence, and this reminds them what they need to look at. And then they can say what their partner did well and what needs improvement. So this is the way I would approach peer feedback. I think that the training part and developing what they're going to use themselves is very important to gain their buy-in or gain their support for doing this. All right, let's move on. So if we revisit just really quickly the definition of feedback literacy, Learners' feedback literacy includes having the understanding, the capacity, and the definition, I can't even say it, deposition needed to make sense of feedback comments and use them to improve. And I hope that you see that these activities allow learners to appreciate and see value in the feedback process, to be willing to work with the feedback, and to provide them with agency and opportunities to use the feedback. And I think it also at least starts to help them to understand the teacher's intention regarding the feedback. All right, next slide. Now, this is the most important one. I really want you to think about it. So with the previous examples in mind, how could you implement these activities to develop feedback literacy in your context? And while we're waiting, Darlene, have these activities made you think of any other ways to develop feedback literacy?
Well, I love the rubric. I think of when I was in the classroom, one thing I would do at the beginning of each semester was a goal setting activity with my students. And I did not have a clear rubric like that. I would just ask them, what do you want to learn? What are you willing to do? And how can I help you? Because I felt like it was important for them to understand that they had to have some skin in the game too. It wasn't just what I, as the teacher, could pour in, but what were they willing to do to grow? And this rubric is so much more specific, especially for English language learners. And so that is one way that I would change the way I process that piece in my classroom. Um, while we're waiting for other responses to come in, I did want to share with you a question from Brenda, who asked, Stephanie, you have so many students. How do you provide their feedback? Is it written?
It is written, and the course does have a rubric. So I follow that pretty closely. We've developed the rubric along with the activities or the writing that they do. So I try to make it very specific why they got the score they got, what they're doing well, and how to improve. But it is a very time-consuming process. And basically, even though I have a lot of students, for the 6 weeks I'm teaching the course, that is almost the only thing I do. And it is only like it's 6 hours a week for each course. And so I have time, even though it takes a lot to sit down and write those thoughtful comments for a lot of students.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Um, we've heard from some of our participants. Tima said, what about a gallery walk maybe for all of their feedback? So a way to develop the literacy in her context. Then we heard from Zania, who said feedback rubric and self-assessment journals.
Mhm.
Yamna said, I really like this last activity. I would adapt it for my undergraduate students who don't always give constructive feedback. So the modeling of the way that peers need to give feedback, she really likes that. So Mia said the students may do the same with their own successive assignments where the teacher has provided feedback. The teacher can ask them to evaluate the feedback they received earlier and how that has changed the following assignment. And then from Joelma, we heard by giving clearer feedback that allows students to reflect on their work and make changes. Adet said, I will group the learners on an assignment and ask them to share their feedback. Afterwards, I will give them a worksheet for their corrections. And then from Farhan, we heard developing a neutral feedback allows students to reflect on their work and make changes. Rafat said, backward design, I would like to discuss on as I am confronting large classes. And Mosa said, that today's activities were very helpful. So keep your responses coming and continue to share in your groups and on social media.
And I love your answers. It seems like, a lot of you have ideas of how you can start thinking about how to develop your students' feedback literacy and help to give them more ownership of the feedback they receive and the whole process. So that makes me really excited. And so to conclude, developing students' feedback literacy will help them to be more autonomous and provide them with a skill that will help them far beyond the classroom. So, as educators, I believe we need to find ways to just encourage students to engage with feedback and see themselves as active participants, which can be something really different for a lot of students. They're used to just seeing the teacher as providing feedback. So, this isn't always easy, but if you ask them questions, they often are quite eager to then start to think about it a little more deeply. Okay, so just to recap, today we discussed feelings about providing feedback and how we view feedback. We also defined both feedback and feedback literacy. We explored some practical applications for improving students' feedback literacy in English language classrooms, and I really hope you found them useful. And then finally, you considered how to include feedback literacy activities in your own lessons. And there were lots of great ideas we didn't get to talk about, but I hope that this has given you something to think about moving forward.
And so thank you, Stephanie, for sharing these practical activities that improve students' ability to understand, reflect on, and implement the feedback that they receive in the English language classroom and in their daily lives. And also, we'd like to thank you, our audience, for your engagement and participation today. Please continue to share your ideas through social media or with your viewing groups after the session ends.